Hello, everyone, and thank you for all of the great questions via email as you work through the lab exercises for our course. I thought I'd address one question that's coming up particularly often about how best to discern whether a variable is qualitative or quantitative in nature. So in this video, I'm going to go ahead and address that. I'm also going to introduce you to this idea of a decision tree. The short answer that I have for you about determining whether a variable is qualitative or quantitative is to say that it's complicated. It's not as simple as just saying, does my variable have numbers? It really depends on how you plan to actually treat the variable in your analysis, and we'll take a look at that. So one of the variables that you're looking at and we've discussed is the variable of age. Suppose that I polled a group of individuals and I'm interested in their ages and recorded their ages. And now I'm asking myself whether it's qualitative or quantitative to make a decision in future analyses or in the analysis that will come next. I find myself typically asking a couple of questions. The first question I ask myself is, am I interested in a relatively large number of possible ages, or am I interested in groupings of ages? So, in terms of relatively large, that might seem vague, but imagine that I recorded some individuals' ages, and the ages ranged from 16 to 30 years old, and I noted it to the whole number a year. This is what I would consider a relatively large number of possible ages. Um, Compared to something like this, where I group individuals into categories. So, are you 16 to 20 years old, 21 to 25 years old, 26 to 30 years old? And so we have these groupings by 5 year range. So this would the in the red here would be an example of a qualitative variable, whereas in the blue section over here, when we have the um, relatively large number of possible ages, that would be an example of a quantitative variable. Now, the next question that I find myself asking when doing research is whether a variable is actually discrete or continuous if it's quantitative. So if it's quantitative, is it discrete or continuous? Um, if I am if I find myself working with groupings and I want to analyze those groupings, I need to ask myself whether or not it's an attribute or whether the data is rankable. And that's going to change the type of analysis that I actually use, statistical analysis strategy. So when I'm looking at quantitative variables and I'm trying to decide whether it's discrete or continuous, I ask myself a couple of questions. The first question is, will all the values be actually recorded as whole numbers? So if they're going to be recorded as whole numbers to the original unit, let's say age and years, um, then I know that those values are going to be discrete. But if I'm going to be analyzing fractional values of the variable, in other words, I would record whether someone said 16 and a half or 17 and a quarter years old, then those fractional values would make the data continuous in nature, quantitative continuous in nature, because I'm actually asking, because I'm willing to assume an infinite number of possible values that someone could be reporting. In this case up here that I've taken, I have whole number year only, so this is an example of a quantitative discrete variable. Looking back at the categorical or qualitative variable questioning process, I might ask myself, does order actually matter? Can the variable categories actually be ranked? And so in the case here, yes, they can be ranked from youngest to oldest, and ranking is relatively important to my analysis. So this is an example of a qualitative ranking of age. So um, so we have this process here where we have to ask ourselves two sets of questions. And so we have a first tier level, and then we have another tier. The first tier asking whether it's a grouping or whether I have a large number of possible values, and then trying to discern whether or not, once I've discerned whether it's qualitative or quantitative, whether or not I'm dealing with an attribute or a ranking in the case of qualitative variables, or whether I'm dealing with discrete or continuous observations with a quantitative variable. So just to summarize, is age in years a qualitative or a quantitative variable? It depends, and it depends on how you plan to treat the variable in your analysis. So that's something that you want to look at it typically in the results section or in the methods section of a paper, or something to think about prior to actually beginning your study. How will you plan to analyze that information? I've introduced you to this idea of a dichotomous decision tree. So this kind of choose your adventure to making decisions is something that's a very useful study tool when acquiring new vocabulary, new terminology, and using it to make decisions. So the the process is not as simple as just asking yourself, is the variable made of numbers? And so that can be a really slippery slope. I think when you're given this language and when you're asked to make these decisions between qualitative and quantitative variables, I think a decision tree is a very useful tool. And then the last point that I made earlier is that variables might be collected as a quantitative observation, but then later you might actually decide to group them into a qualitative variable for analysis. So just keep that in mind as you're moving along. And sometimes that's why it's good to read both the methods and the results section of a paper. And when you're designing your own research, keep in mind that you might be collecting things in a quantitative nature and making quantitative observations that you later put into groupings that make sense to you as either an attribute or a rank. All right, keep those questions coming, and I will put together videos as quick as I can.